Thank you all for being here. I'm Steve Kane, CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership. We've got a great group assembled here. I want to thank all of the co-conveners around this, Good Reason Houston, the Greater Houston Community Foundation, the Greater Houston Partnership, the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, and United Way of Greater Houston. And I also want to thank all of the supporting partners who are listed out here that help make this possible. So I see many of you were over at the event at Hilton Americas just now, and I'm going to report for Carrie. That event was 4 times as big as it was last year. 4 times. I literally saw people high-fiving Carrie in the hallway, but I think what that shows you and what this room shows you and what these couple of days are going to show you is there's a lot of momentum around the issue of economic mobility and achieving better economic mobility in Houston. You see it in our corporate partners, you see it in our educators, you see it in our political figures, you see it in our foundations. We're all kind of rallying around this right now. So let's keep that momentum going and make some real progress. We've got the opportunity to do that. When Houstonians get together and decide to do something, it gets done. It gets done. So let's keep this going. All right, it's my privilege to introduce Steve Maislin. Steve is the president and CEO of the Greater Houston Community Foundation and one of the convening partners here. So Steve, if you would come up, there you are.
Thanks, appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, and I also want to take a moment to thank the co-convening team that pulled this together, because it would not have happened without their determination and hard work, so I appreciate it. I also want to thank each of you for making time to be here today. As Steve just noted, this is a cross-section of leaders from the community. Someone just said to me, not just people who are interested in this topic, but who are positioned to do something about it, from education, business, nonprofits, the foundation community, education, government, you name it. So it's a really exciting convening, and we'll talk about the details to come in just a moment. The fact that so many of you are willing to be here in this room speaks to the urgency and importance of this topic. And so it's a really important moment for us to come together like this. Now, this summit is not just another event. It's a chance for us to build a shared understanding of the state of economic mobility in Houston, where we're making progress, where we're falling behind, what the opportunities are for the future, what the challenge really is that we will face together. We'll explore the latest research in just a moment. We'll start down that path and we'll continue it tomorrow, learning from leaders who are deeply engaged in this work, who are national thought leaders and data experts. So we're working from a base of true knowledge as we think about this, but also as we begin charting a path forward, because we all know that meaningful change, particularly in this area, does not happen overnight. It's also paramount that we create a roadmap together. Advancing economic mobility is a long-term effort that requires time, resources, and cross-sector collaboration. We all know that no single organization can move the needle forward in this work. We're going to need to leverage each of our unique strengths and align to drive meaningful purpose, fill crucial gaps, and create mechanisms for feedback and accountability. Now, together, our organizations have convened this summit because we share a bold vision for Houston's future, a future where it is truly possible for anyone, as you heard earlier today, anyone, no matter where they start, to move up the economic ladder. That's really our purpose. We believe that Houston can and should, and dare I say must, lead the nation in upward mobility as one of the most diverse and fastest growing regions in America. We're more than just a city, we're a bellwether. If we fail to expand economic mobility, we risk leaving behind the very people who make Houston strong, vibrant, and a beacon for so many. Conversely, if, and maybe when, we get it right, Houston's shared prosperity can fuel the next generation of growth, and innovation. Now, for the Community Foundation, this effort aligns perfectly with our purpose to inspire and create meaningful and positive change with our donors and for our community. Now, our donors, as some of you may know, are a very active group of philanthropic investors in this community that we're privileged to work with over our short 30-year history, and that's short in the Community Foundation field. They've given out over $2.7 billion, and a good deal of that money went straight into the greater Houston region, a number we're really proud of. Thank you. And through our Understanding Houston initiative, which many of you know well, we've spent years partnering with our friends and colleagues at the Kinder Institute to compile and analyze data and insights on issues that shape opportunity and quality of life in our region, from education to housing to health to economic opportunity and beyond. We believe that data and a deep understanding of our community should not just inform, but should also inspire action. It's really kind of the basis of that entire partnership. This summit is an extension of that belief by grounding ourselves in evidence and learning from the best research available. We can make smart decisions, target resources more effectively, and work together to scale what works. So we're proud to help convene this effort, but real progress will depend on the partnerships and commitments that are forged in this room and indeed in the months and years to come. Again, it's a long-term investment. So our agenda for today will start by building a shared understanding of economic mobility, guided by insights from national and local leaders in the field who are shaping real solutions. Dr. Raj Chetty will provide a presentation exploring what the data tells us about economic mobility, both nationally, but also here in Houston, and explore drivers that can truly move the needle. Then Dr. Ruth Lopez-Turley will then discuss the research with Dr. Chetty, digging in even deeper into what he and his team have learned. Then we'll have time for Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will pass a microphone over to you. And please don't be shy about asking your questions. I feel funny saying that to this audience. Following that, you'll have time to reflect and discuss the conversations at your table, and then we will have a networking reception, and we encourage you to be intentional about reaching out and meeting people you don't know and talking about issues that really attracted your attention during the presentation. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce someone whose work has helped us understand economic mobility in America and in our specific cities as well. Dr. Chetty is the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and the Director of Opportunity Insights, which uses big data to study the science of economic opportunity. How can we give children from all backgrounds a better chance of succeeding? Dr. Chetty's work has been widely cited just about everywhere in academia, media outlets, policy discussions in this country and around the world, shaping understanding, informing policy and practice, and inspiring collective action over the last decade. Dr. Chetty received his PhD from Harvard University in 2003 and is one of the youngest tenured professors in the history of the university. He's received numerous grants, including the numerous awards, including the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, the John Bates Clark Medal given to the Economist under 40, whose work is judged to have made the most significant contribution to the field, and Harvard's George Ledley Prize, an award for research that made the most valuable contribution to science or in any way for the benefit of mankind. Someone was thoughtful in describing that award. We're very honored to have Dr. Chetty with us today, so please help me give him a warm Houston welcome. Dr. Chetty.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my mic on here. Okay, great. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Is that working? I don't see the... Okay, so hopefully you're able to hear me? Clear enough? Okay, great. Well, so thank you so much for the very warm introduction, Steve. It's really a pleasure to be here in Houston, to have a chance to speak with some of you earlier today at the event over at the Hilton and to see others of you. So I'm going to talk about economic opportunity here in Houston, what we've learned about how we increase and benefit children's chances. Yeah, it's not on, right? That's what I thought. If somebody can tell. Yeah. If the battery's out here, it's just not going on.
Is the light on?
The light is not on. I think that's the issue. Yeah.
Bring a uni mic.
Or yeah. You can use a handheld, that's fine. All right. Okay, great. Is that better? Yes. Excellent. Okay, thank you. All right, so for those of you who were there this morning, I'm going to share some data that's going to overlap with what you saw earlier, but go deeper into it. And for those who weren't there, hopefully some of these insights will be helpful for you to understand both the state of economic opportunity here in Houston and what we can do to give children better chances of rising up, and more broadly in the United States. So I'm going to start by zooming out and not start at the local level in Houston, which I'm going to zoom into in a second, but rather at the national level by talking about the American dream, which is a complex concept. It has different meanings to different people. One cornerstone aspect of the American dream is the idea that we aspire to be a country where through hard work, any child has the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. Certainly it was that sort of aspiration that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. And so I want to start with this chart here, where, okay, I think we're missing a slide, but let me describe the chart to you. So I'll do my best. I want to start by talking about whether children are actually able to achieve that notion of the American dream. What fraction of kids can, in fact, rise up in the income distribution relative to their parents? And so in a study my colleagues and I did a few years ago, we assessed the extent to which children end up doing better than their parents, simply measuring what fraction of kids go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And what you see in the data is that for kids born in the middle of the last century, say like back in 1940, more than 90% of kids at that time went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what's happening in the present day, take kids born in the 1980s, who are turning 35 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, turns out it's become a 50-50 shot, essentially a coin flip as to whether you're going to achieve that notion of the American dream. And so in that sense, the American dream has sort of faded over time, where children's chances of rising up look much weaker than they did in the past. Now, that trend of the fading American dream is, of course, of central interest to economists like myself, because it reflects a fundamental change in the economy that we want to understand. It's also, I think, of fundamental social and political interest in the US, because it's that very lack of opportunity defined in that way that I think reflects the frustration that many people are feeling, that this is no longer a country where maybe even through hard work, it's easy to get ahead. And so motivated by that trend, that sets the stage for our conversation today on economic opportunity. In our team, Opportunity Insights at Harvard, we are motivated by the big picture question of what is driving that fading of the American dream, and more importantly, what can we do going forward to increase children's chances of rising up from all backgrounds. Now, lots of people, including many of you in this room, have been studying these issues. People have been interested in these sorts of questions going back a century. Our angle on it, and the reason I think we're able to make some progress in studying these issues, is that we have large-scale data now. We're in an era of tremendous amount of information in our society, and we are trying to employ the tools of big data to try to better understand, as Steve put it in the introduction, the science of economic opportunity. What are the key drivers that help kids thrive, that help people rise up and achieve their potential? And so what I'm going to do in this talk is show you a series of different analyses we've done to understand that science of economic opportunity. And I'm going to start with this first map here, which gives you a geographic breakdown of what economic opportunity looks like in the United States. Okay, so this map shows you the geography of upward mobility in America. To understand it, I'm going to first take a minute to describe how we construct this map, and then I'm going to tell you what I think we learn from it. So what we've done here is taken data on 20 million children, gotten information on them from anonymized tax returns, which we link back to their parents. You all know that if you have kids, that you write your kids' names, social security numbers on your tax return to claim them as dependents, and that gives you a way to link children to parents and tax record data. And we then are able to link those kids back to the exact location in which they grew up. And we divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And we compute a simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, suppose you grew up in a low-income family, which I'm going to define to be concrete in this presentation, as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. So that's a family making about $27,000 a year, measured in real 2015 dollars. Suppose you grew up in such a low-income family. How do you yourself do when we measure your income in adulthood as measured by your 1040 tax return when you're 35 years old? So to give you a concrete example, you look at the data here for Boston, kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, on average, are making $36,800 when we're looking at their tax returns when they're 35 years old, right? So similarly, we can construct that statistic for every other part of the United States. We color the map so that the red-orange colors are places where you're less likely to rise up and achieve the American dream, and the green colors are places where kids have higher levels of upward mobility. So if you start here by just looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side, you can see that even in the 1980s, these are all kids growing up in the early 1980s, for that cohort of kids, there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up. So there's some parts of the country, like take a look at rural Iowa or much of the center of the US. If you're a kid born to a low-income family in a place like Dubuque, Iowa, or other parts of that state, on average, you're making $50,000 one generation later, more than twice as much your parents were. And so in a single generation, that's a tremendous amount of upward mobility in that area. Yet you have other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, or much of the Southeast, where kids starting out at that exact same income level of $27,000 a year, they are on average making only $26,300 in their mid-30s, which is kind of unbelievable if you think about it. All of this is measured in real terms. The fact that you're not really doing better than your parents, given how much economic growth has occurred in the US in general and in Charlotte in particular, is shocking. It's showing a bunch of people are being left behind, essentially, and not contributing to that growth as they could. So, of course, you are interested in the data here in Houston. So we've labeled Houston. Houston comes out with the average income of $33,000 for kids in their mid-30s if they grew up in low-income families. Where does that stand in the distribution? Houston's basically in the middle. You can see it's like in the middle of that spectrum. It's pretty good, actually, relative to many other urban areas where you see relatively low levels of mobility. But it's not, at the top, and clearly there could be higher levels of mobility if you compare to some other cities in America. I'll also note these data are for kids born in the late 70s, early 1980s. We have more recently started to do analyses of kids born in more recent years. The nature of economic mobility is obviously that it takes time to see outcomes. You can't look at economic mobility for the kids growing up today until they actually grow up. So most recent set of data that you can look at is kids born, say, in the 1990s. The picture for Houston looks more or less the same as it does in the map that I'm showing you. There's a little bit of progress, but on average, Houston is roughly where it was a decade ago. So you should think of the data that I'm going to be showing you here as roughly representative of the most recent state of play here in this city. So when you look at this national map, naturally your eye gravitates to the broad regional variation, right? The Midwest versus the Southeast, et cetera. But it turns out that actually the level at which the variation emerges is much narrower than that. It's much more granular than that. And so to show you that, I'm going to now zoom in and show you the data here in Houston at the neighborhood level, where we're replicating the exact same statistics, but we are calculating them based on the census tract in which you grew up. Now, I'll just note for those who are interested, you can go to a website, opportunityatlas.org, just type that in your phone or in your computer, and you can type in your home address and literally like a Google map, go and look at what the data looks like for your own neighborhood, for different subgroups and so on, maybe a useful resource for you going forward. So here we've just taken a snapshot of that Opportunity Atlas data. And what you can see, you all have a much better understanding of neighborhoods in Houston than I do, so you'll recognize some of the patterns here. But the simple point I want to make from kind of a 1,000-foot level, what's striking about this map to me is that the spectrum of colors you're seeing on the screen is the same as the spectrum of colors that I showed you on the national map a second ago. We have not changed the color scale here. So what is that telling you? It's telling you that you can go a few miles down the road in Houston, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of children's economic mobility, their chances of rising up. That is a very important point, I think, to understand in terms of thinking about what interventions are going to matter, because it shows you that this plays out not at the state level or the city level. It's about things that you can do at a very local level. What's happening on one side of the street versus another side of the street maybe gets you starting to think about mechanisms like what schools kids are going to, or who they're interacting with, or what kinds of opportunities they have at this very hyper local level. So the first point I want to be clear on is that we should be thinking about the unit at which we're going to intervene at this granular level. That's really where these things are playing out. So naturally then, the question that emerges is what is different about the places that are in the green colors on this map from the red colors, and how can we, if you think about what's the objective of these conversations we're having, at some level the goal is to try to make all of this map look like it's in a green color. Kids should not have opportunities to rise up just in certain parts of Houston. We want them to have opportunities to rise up in all of Houston, no matter where they happen to grow up. And so how can we get there? So that question has motivated a large body of research in economics and other adjacent fields over the past decade. As our team has been able to construct statistics like this, many other researchers have been able to analyze these and other data. You can basically think of these new data, to make an analogy to the sciences, as a new tool, a microscope, if you will, a new lens to study the science of economic opportunity, where we can start to ask questions like what's different about certain neighborhoods in Houston versus others, what happens when kids move from one place to another, and as I'll show you in a second, that can really help us understand the drivers of economic mobility in a far more precise way than we were able to in the past. Now, why is that scientific analysis useful? Ultimately, it's useful because hopefully it can inform policy decisions and interventions that you all might be able to implement that will ultimately actually change people's outcomes on the ground. And so motivated by that two-part logic, in the first part of this presentation, what I'm going to do is give you a quick tour of what we and others have learned from a decade of research on the drivers of economic mobility, and the second half transition to what that scientific understanding means for interventions that we can implement going forward. And I look forward to discussing that further in the conversation with Ruth and with all of you. So let's start by digging into the determinants of economic mobility. The first analysis that I'm going to show you is an analysis we've done looking at children who move across areas that turns out to be quite illuminating in understanding how the environment in which you grow up affects your life outcomes. So rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, where we looked at millions of kids who move across different neighborhoods, I'm going to focus on one particular example, which may be familiar to some of you here in Houston. I'm going to contrast two neighborhoods, Brayburn and Sharpstown. You can see that kids who grow up in low-income families in Brayburn unfortunately don't have great chances of rising up at the moment. In Sharpstown, your probability of rising up looks much better. So what I want you to do is think about the following. Suppose you've got a family that moves from Brayburn to Sharpstown. Let's think about how their kids' outcomes change. And the way I want you to think about this analysis is look at families who make this move from Brayburn to Sharpstown, or more generally from a red-colored neighborhood to a green-colored neighborhood, with kids of different ages, okay? So I'll illustrate what we find in that analysis in this chart here. So we see that if you grow up from birth in Brayburn, you end up with an average income in adulthood of about $25,000 a year. If you grow up from birth in Sharpstown, you do much better. You have an average income of $36,000 or possibly even higher than that. So now take a set of families who move from Brayburn to Sharpstown, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. So what we're doing in that first green dot that you see plotted there is taking the set of families who made this move, following their children over 30 years, and measure their own incomes when they're in their 30s. And what you see in that first green dot is that those kids who made this move when they were 2 years old, on average, they're making about $32,200 in adulthood when we look at their tax returns. Okay, so that's for the kids who moved when they were exactly 2. Now let's repeat this analysis, looking at kids who moved from Brayburn to Sharpstown when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on. What do you see? You see this very clear declining pattern. The later you move from Brayburn to Sharpstown, or more generally, from a red-colored neighborhood to a green-colored neighborhood, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat, and you see no further change in outcomes. So what are the takeaways from this chart? I think there are 3 key points to take away. The first is that where you grow up really influences your life outcomes. It's not just that the types of kids living in one neighborhood are different from another. Apparently, if a given child moves from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, you see really big changes in their life outcomes. And I'll note that this holds not just when we compare kids in different families, you actually see exactly the same pattern, even when you look at siblings within the same family. So take a family that moves with a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. You see the 3-year-old start to do better than the 7-year-old on average, exactly in proportion to the number of years they're growing up in that better environment. So that point, I think, is very encouraging, actually. It suggests that you don't need to look back to the 1940s or to some totally different place to find a place with higher levels of economic mobility. Actually, if you move just a few miles down the road in your own city, you can see dramatic improvements in kids' outcomes. That shows you that this problem is tractable. Like, we can actually change this if we can just figure out what is going on that's better in some places than others. The second key point that you see here is that what really matters are the formative years, childhood to early adulthood, rather than what's going on in adulthood. We find in this and many other studies that if people move to a different area when they're adults, you don't see significant changes in their job prospects or economic outcomes. It's really about the environment in which you're growing up and when you're entering the labor market and so on. The third thing you see is that there's kind of a dosage effect here, to make a medical analogy. Every extra year that you spend growing up in a better environment, the better you do in the long run. That's important because, as you all know, there's been a lot of focus on early childhood intervention in recent years, and I think that's well warranted. Early childhood interventions, we think, can make a big difference. But you see in this chart that moving to a better environment when you're 5 instead of 10 or 10 instead of 15 continues to help you. The childhood environment matters throughout childhood. And so the earlier you move, the better it is to a better area, the better it is, because basically you get more years of dosage to that better environment. So the punchline from that is we should be thinking about how to improve environments, not just at the earliest years, but throughout childhood until people are entering the labor market in their early 20s, okay? So naturally, if you kind of think about the thought process here of scientific discovery, once we had these sorts of findings, and then we convinced ourselves that the environment in which people are growing up really seems to matter, you're probably next wondering, okay, if we think there's a big causal effect of growing up in a place like Sharpstown versus Braeburn, what is it that's different about Sharpstown versus Braeburn? What are they doing differently that's leading to better outcomes for kids? Because that's really the key to figure out how we can replicate that success. So we and others have written, there are now more than 100 academic papers trying to answer exactly that question, looking at a variety of different factors, from local schools to other organizations to availability of resources to connections to jobs, all kinds of different factors that might predict these differences in economic mobility across areas. Let me summarize here in this slide the 4 strongest predictors of economic mobility that have been identified to date. The first is lower poverty rates. So we find that growing up in a community that is more mixed income tends to be a place where you're more likely to rise up. If you don't grow up in a place where everyone is low income around you, if you're growing up in a more mixed income area, we see significantly higher chances of rising up. A second strong pattern you see in the data is that places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families, for example, systematically in the data tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And then finally, places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this idea of social capital because I actually think it might be the most important of these 4 factors. It's also one that people have talked about in broad terms for a very long time. People like my colleague Bob Putnam at Harvard, some of you might know his famous book, Bowling Alone, other work like that in the sociology literature. But it has been difficult to measure very precisely exactly what we mean by social capital and ultimately how we might change social capital going forward. So what is social capital? People in the past have talked about ideas like the strength of a community, who your friends are, what your networks look like, who are you interacting with. So I think all of those notions are potentially important. We had the sense that social capital could be quite important, so we ended up setting up a collaboration with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta to use modern social network data to create very granular measures of social capital to study if and how it might be relevant for economic mobility. And let me summarize what we found from that analysis with this pair of maps here. So the map on the left is the same map of economic mobility constructed using tax records that we've already discussed. The map on the right is a very different map. It's a map constructed using an entirely different data set, Facebook data, where we get data on 72 million users of Facebook between the ages of 25 and 44. We use a machine learning algorithm to predict everyone's income, and then we measure the degree of cross-class friendships on Facebook. So in particular, we ask, suppose you have below median income, you're a relatively low-income person on Facebook. What fraction of your Facebook contacts have above median income? So it's just asking how connected are low-income folks to high-income folks in every county in America. In the map on the right, the green colors are places where low-income people have more high-income friends. The red colors are places where there's more disconnection by class, where there's less cross-class interaction. You can see the result here immediately for yourself. The map on the right looks incredibly similar to the map on the left. Those two measures are incredibly strongly correlated. This actually turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility anyone's identified to date. And so this notion of social capital, this particular measure of social capital, cross-class interaction, turns out to be very important as a predictor of economic mobility and actually as a causal determinant of economic mobility. So in work we've not yet released publicly, but will do in the next year or so, this is just a correlational analysis, right? We're showing the places that have higher levels of social capital tend to have higher levels of economic mobility. Obviously, there could be other differences between those places, so can't necessarily draw a causal link just from this map. We're doing more detailed work where we're exploiting essentially random fluctuations in the extent to which kids have high-income friends, coming from the fact that when you go to a given school, your peer group kind of fluctuates randomly across cohorts. There may happen to be more high-income kids in one year, slightly fewer high-income kids in the next year. That creates a bit of random variation, even for kids going to the same school and the extent to which they're connected to higher-income folks. And you can pick up, even at that level of precision, clear differences in kids' chances of going to college, their ultimate incomes, as a result of that exposure. So we are quite convinced, based on this kind of analysis, that who you're connected to, and this particular notion of social capital, turns out other measures of social capital, how many friends you have, how dense your networks are, other things people have talked about, don't predict economic mobility. It's this notion of cross-class interaction that seems really central, not just at the national level that you see here, but also at the local level. So if you zoom in and look at the data zip code by zip code here in Houston, and again, you can go to the Opportunity Atlas and look at this data for yourself, you can see that it's the communities where low-income kids are most disconnected from high-income kids that they are least likely to rise up. Now, what exactly is the mechanism driving that? We don't know for sure yet. I think there are many plausible mechanisms. We know that more than 50% of jobs in America are obtained through referrals. If you're in a network where lots of people are working at higher paying firms, other institutions, they can give you access to that internship or to that pathway to a job. That can make a difference. But I actually think there's likely a deeper mechanism than that, and it's about kids' aspirations and what you kind of see yourself doing in your own life in relation to who you see around you. If you've never met somebody who's gone to college, never met somebody who's pursued a career in science or in business or in other fields, I think it just doesn't even occur to you that that could be a possibility. If you're in a community with these cross-class interactions, that creates pathways for kids that they may end up ultimately pursuing, especially if they're supported in pursuing those pathways. It remains to be discovered through further research exactly which of these mechanisms is most important. What I think we can be quite confident of is that this notion of connecting people across backgrounds is extremely important in driving economic mobility going forward. Okay, so I've shown you very quickly a bunch of different research findings, how we're getting more and more precise. You can kind of see it as peeling back the layers of the onion and trying to understand the science of economic mobility. What I want to do in the remaining time is talk about how you can take some of these research findings and use them to inform policy interventions to increase economic mobility, the ultimate thing that we all care about here. And I'm going to organize this discussion by talking about 3 areas where our team is currently working, which I think follow naturally from the set of research findings that I've just shown you. So to summarize, if I were to give a one-sentence summary of what we've learned from a decade of research on economic opportunity, it's that the drivers of economic mobility are hyper-local. It's about your family and the environment in which you're growing up at a very local level, from birth to something like early adulthood. So if you have that view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to try to improve economic mobility going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. So if I know that a few miles down the road in Houston, kids have better opportunities to rise up, what if we just try to give more low-income families access to those neighborhoods through things like housing vouchers, affordable housing, other kinds of policies that may essentially reduce segregation in the city, sort of a moving to opportunity approach. As I'll show you, I think that approach does have significant promise and there's real impact from it, but obviously it's not scalable. You can't move everyone in certain neighborhoods of Houston to other neighborhoods. Not everybody wants to move to a different neighborhood. So that brings me to the second approach, which is place-based investment. The way I think about that is how can you take, in the maps that I've been showing you, take those red-colored neighborhoods and turn them into green colors? What can you do to invest in those places to transform economic mobility in those areas? And we're seeing some really promising evidence on programs that I think can make a quite significant difference on that front as well. And then finally, the key touch point for most kids after they're age 18 is not the home in which they're growing up, but the institution of higher education they might attend. And I think that there's a lot that we can do in our higher education system and our workforce training systems to amplify their impact on economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these 3 areas, and then I'll conclude. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach, where I'm going to take you, first, I'm going to show you some data here in Houston that illustrates what I see as some of the challenges in our current systems. So let's go back to the map of the Opportunity Atlas in Houston that I showed you a second ago, and overlay now in the black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. So as a bit of institutional background that surely many of you will know, we spend about $60 billion a year, more than that now, in the United States on various affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are housing choice vouchers that give nearly 2.5 million families rental assistance, essentially, to find housing that's more stable in better neighborhoods and so on. What we've done here is we're showing where families receiving those vouchers currently live in Houston. And you may notice a puzzling pattern, which is that even though these families are receiving this rental assistance from the government, which part of the intention is to give them access to better neighborhoods, they're not, in fact, using those vouchers to move to neighborhoods where we see, based on the analysis I just showed you, they're more likely to break out of poverty in the next generation. In particular, those black dots are concentrated in the red-colored neighborhoods in the city, even though we're spending billions of dollars supporting families with these vouchers. That's a pattern that you see not just in Houston, but in cities across the country. So let me give you another example where our team has done some work. Here's the same kind of data in Seattle, snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas in Seattle. Look at where the housing voucher holders live. They tend to live in the lowest opportunity parts of the city. Now you might think, okay, maybe it's just a matter of affordability. Some of these neighborhoods that are in the green colors, they're very expensive. Maybe you can't afford to live there even with a voucher. That turns out not to be correct. These vouchers are worth about $1,500 a month of rental assistance in Seattle. If you just do the math and look at what rents look like in some of these neighborhoods, there are completely affordable neighborhoods where these families could move in principle and end up having much better outcomes for their kids. So when we put out the Opportunity Atlas data a few years ago, the Housing and Urban Development Agency and a number of housing authorities around the country approached us and said, why are we noticing this puzzling pattern that the vouchers don't seem to be actually facilitating moves to opportunity, and can we do something about that? So what came out of that was an interesting intervention that we set up as a randomized trial in collaboration with the Seattle and King County housing authorities that we call Creating Moves to Opportunity, which essentially tested why families were staying in lower opportunity areas despite receiving this assistance from the government, and tested strategies to try to help families move to higher opportunity areas. The way I think about what this intervention did is it's essentially like a social capital intervention. It's giving people the same voucher, but connecting them to a navigator, a counselor, who helps them find housing in a high opportunity area if they want to move to such a place. They weren't forced to move to such a place. Just if you wanted to move to a high opportunity area, somebody would help you out. They would connect you to landlords, help form those networks, help you negotiate, give you a little bit of short-term financial assistance if you needed it to pay a security deposit or an application fee. And so the idea is you took 1,000 families, flipped a coin, half the families just got the voucher, got 4 months to find housing wherever they wanted. That's the standard protocol. Often, I would say more generally, a paradigm in federal government programs is that we focus on the dollars that we're spending on programs and give people resources, but not necessarily on the implementation of how we actually help people use those resources. And so essentially what this trial did is for the other half of people, give them that additional support, assistance to use the voucher more effectively if people wanted to do so. Set up as a randomized trial, we follow these families over time, look at where they end up living. Here's the answer. In the control group, only 14% of families moved to high opportunity areas, one of those green colored neighborhoods in the maps that I was showing you. In the treatment group, more than half the families end up moving to one of the high opportunity places. Now, just to underscore the magnitudes here, this intervention, to be clear, is not cheap. It costs about $2,500 a family, but that is a very small amount when compared with two benchmarks. First, we are already spending $100,000 per family on these vouchers in the $1,500 a month of rental assistance, year after year. So the incremental cost is only 2% relative to that base. But more importantly, we estimate based on our prior work that the kids who got lucky essentially and ended up in the green bar, on average, they're gonna go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes than the kids who end up in the control in the lower opportunity neighborhoods. So that incremental $2,500 of investment has an enormous social rate of return and shows you how thinking carefully about, you could do exactly the same thing in Houston. How can you think about helping families who want to move to these neighborhoods that would help them achieve much better outcomes at very little incremental cost, right? So these are the kinds of things I think we need to be unlocking that can really make a difference even in an era of constrained budgets and so on. I like this example not just because I think it made a difference here, but it's also an example of data and research and objective analysis informing policy more broadly. So after we did this work in Seattle, there was a bill passed in Congress authorizing about $80 million to replicate what we did in Seattle in 8 other cities across America. A few months ago, an independent team of researchers released an analysis, again conducted based on randomized trials in these 8 other cities, showing that the social support approach replicating what we did in Seattle increased moves to high opportunity areas by a factor of 6 on average in these other places. And so this really seems like an approach that scales. And in light of that evidence, there's been a bill proposed by bipartisan sponsors, Republican and Democratic senators in Congress to expand the housing voucher program, expand these sorts of supports that I think could have a really meaningful impact, if eventually implemented on thousands of kids' lives across the country. And so this is an example of a space. Housing vouchers are one particular thing, but more generally, kind of extrapolating based on that, policies like the low-income housing tax credit, zoning for multifamily development, there are lots of different things through which I think we can help families gain access to higher opportunity areas, and that is a really viable path, in my view, of creating opportunity for a group of people. Now, as I emphasized earlier, that approach has limits to scale. There's only so many people you can help move to higher opportunity areas. And so I want to next spend some time talking about the place-based investment approach, where I'll talk about one particular program, the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which is the biggest effort that the federal government has made to revitalize high poverty neighborhoods and try to turn them into thriving areas. We spent about $17 billion on this program, revitalizing 261 high poverty public housing projects. Here's an example in Houston, a place called the San Felipe Courts, you can see on the left. Literally that same piece of land. Here's a picture on the right after they revitalized. Physically, of course, looks very different. It's now a mixed income housing development with lots of services and so on. So this is a program on which we spent $17 billion, but we haven't really known, did this work? Did it actually create a higher opportunity area? And so in a study our team will put out actually in a couple of months, we've not yet publicly released, but we've just about finished. We have linked data from HUD to tax record data to follow children over long periods of time and essentially ask the question, suppose you happen to grow up in the neighborhood as it existed on the left, and I happen to grow up in the same exact neighborhood as it existed on the right. do we have different outcomes on average? Okay, and so let me show you what we found from that analysis with, again, just a simple illustrative chart. So what this chart is showing you is the average earnings of kids growing up in these projects that were subsequently revitalized. They were revitalized at the point of that dashed vertical line. If you look at the very first dot on the left, what it's telling you is that the kids who grew up there 10 years before revitalization, if we follow them into adulthood and measure their average incomes at that point, they were making about $25,000 a year when they grew up. The same is true for the kids who were growing up there 9 years before, 8 years before, 7 years before. It's basically like a flat line, right? So now let's look at what happens after the neighborhood's revitalized. You can see that there's a tremendous change in the trajectory. The children who are growing up there afterward have significantly higher incomes in adulthood, and it only gets better over time as the neighborhood gets fully revitalized and so on. Once again, if you do the math, this was a pretty expensive program, $17 billion, but if you count the benefits over cohorts and cohorts of children, the many thousands of kids' lives who are impacted, this has an incredibly high rate of return, once again, for taxpayers and for society and for these children. When you dig in a little bit deeper and ask how is this program working? What's the mechanism through which it is leading to improvements in children's outcomes? It turns out that a key predictor of where Hope 6 was most beneficial is how strong the surrounding community is. So when we divide public housing projects into places where kids in the surrounding area are doing very well in the surrounding 1 mile radius. So think of it as essentially the surrounding 1 mile radius looks like it's more in a green color in the Opportunity Atlas maps as opposed to a red color. In those places where the surrounding area is thriving, when we revitalize the public housing project, we see big gains for the children. On the left side of this chart, if the surrounding area has very low levels of upward mobility and I revitalize the public housing project, it has no impact on kids' outcomes. So what's the conceptual model? What we think is going on is you can basically think of these public housing developments as pre-revitalization sort of islands that were cut off from the surrounding neighborhood. The revitalization program ended up reducing rates of crime, created more direct interaction, again comes back to social capital, across these communities. If you were interacting with a set of kids who themselves had good opportunities and were doing well, that ended up lifting you up as well. And so once again, this theme that I've been emphasizing of who people are interacting with seems central in understanding why these efforts matter too. So Hope 6 is a really big, very large physical investment. I think it can be done in other places as well. You don't necessarily need to completely tear down a community and rebuild it in order to make strides towards this integration approach that I'm describing here. There are things that you could do that are smaller, that could involve other mechanisms like transit, programs that bring people together and so on. The point I want to emphasize is that change is possible. That's what I find encouraging in these data. You don't just have to move people to different neighborhoods. You can bring opportunity to people where they currently live. Let me wrap up by just spending a few final minutes on the last bucket of higher education and workforce training, where our team is spending a lot of time at the moment, and I think is also a space where we can make a lot of progress here in Houston and elsewhere. To set the stage for this, I want to first show you some data on how colleges contribute to economic mobility. So just like our team has released statistics on how economic mobility varies across neighborhoods in America, we've also constructed statistics on how every college in America contributes to economic mobility. And when you think about a college's contribution to economic mobility, you should think about two dimensions. The vertical dimension here, on the vertical axis, what we're plotting is what we call the upward mobility rate. Take the set of kids who come from families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution and ask what fraction of them 10 years after college end up reaching the top 20% of the income distribution. So to give you an example, my own institution, Harvard, or you look at Stanford, MIT, they look terrific on that dimension. The vast majority of kids who come from low-income families and attend those colleges, they end up in the upper middle class or beyond when we look at their tax records 10 years after graduation. But a college's contribution to economic mobility depends not just on how well low-income kids do after they attend that college, but how many low-income kids you are educating to begin with. And on that dimension, which is what's plotted on the horizontal axis, what fraction of kids come from families in the bottom 20%, you can see that those colleges that I just named, the highly selective private institutions in the US, do not fare so well. Less than 3% of kids at many of those colleges come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And so just mechanically, they cannot be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility because they're just not educating that many low-income children to begin with. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you can see that there are a number of colleges, including here in the Texas and Houston area, that are educating a number of kids from low-income families. So they're serving, a population that's very important in that context. But unfortunately, if you look at the outcomes at those colleges, they don't look so great. Not that many kids are doing particularly well, reaching the upper middle class, sometimes even achieving a living wage after attending those institutions. And so the challenge, big picture, in terms of why I think our colleges are not contributing adequately to economic mobility can be visualized in this chart is basically the point that there are no dots, more or less, in the upper right side of this chart. You need to be in the upper right side of this chart in order to be contributing to economic mobility, right? Educating a lot of low-income kids and helping them do well. And we don't have many of those kinds of institutions in the US in general, and here in Houston in particular. And I like that way of visualizing it because it also points to how we can think about the solution. Can we move the dots that are on the upper left, places like Rice, over to the right, expand access to lower income kids to those institutions that are delivering great outcomes? Can we improve outcomes at some of the local community colleges that are serving lots of low-income kids and help them achieve better outcomes after college? So lots to be said, and we can get into this more in the Q&A if people are interested in how exactly we can achieve those goals. Let me show you one example that I find informative, sort of an exception that illustrates a path that we are spending a lot of time on that I think could be useful. So here I've highlighted a college that happens to be kind of in the upper right, called the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology. It's a small college near LaGuardia Airport in Queens, and it does exactly what you'd think based on its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology. And what you can see about it that's interesting to me is it takes lots of kids from low and middle income backgrounds and gives them a path to reach the upper middle class, because aeronautics and technology is a field that's in demand and pays pretty well. And so what that shows you is, I think of that as kind of like a modern day vocational training, right? That giving people these well-defined career paths in certain contexts can really be a pathway to upward mobility. That's one small, exception, but I think it generalizes. And so to show you that, I want to talk for a second about one example of a variety of workforce training programs our team is now studying. This is a program called Year Up. It's a one-year job training program where they teach people a set of skills. That's step one, as you can see in this chart. But then very importantly, and this connects back to the social capital theme, they kind of help you build a network. They don't just say, we're going to give you some skills in IT or financial operations, like good luck finding a job with that, which is what old job training programs did, and were not shown to be very successful. The new wave of programs where we are seeing very large impacts are programs that connect you to a specific employer, give you this wraparound mentoring support, help you get a job that can make use of those skills. And what you find in randomized trials, where they took, this was a trial run back in 2014, they took about 3,000 people, half of them got access to the Year Up program, half of them didn't. We've linked that data to tax record data to follow people's earnings over time. Before 2014, there was no difference. In 2014, when people were participating in the program, their earnings fell in the green. Those are the program participants relative to the randomized control group, because they were doing the training and not working as much. And then afterward, remarkably, you see this $9,000 increase in earnings that persists for a decade afterward as a result of that one-year training, again showing an incredibly high rate of return in this context. We're finding these kinds of impacts with Year Up, with Perscalis, another program that's like this, Project Quest, which is a program that operates in San Antonio, a number of other programs that I think show a lot of promise in this space. And so this is another area where, coming back to your community colleges and local institutions, I think there's a lot that can be done to increase economic mobility by pairing with these sorts of approaches. Let me end by showing you one final set of data that approaches these issues from a different perspective. So when a lot of us think about economic mobility, myself included, what draws us to these issues is the view, sort of a perspective of justice and fairness. Everyone should have a shot at achieving their potential, achieving the American dream, no matter their background, no matter where they grew up, no matter their family. But I think while that motivation is extremely important, you can also have sort of a colder economist motivation, if you'd like, for why these issues are important, just from the perspective of maximizing growth and maximizing talent for local businesses. When we have people with better opportunities to rise up, we prospects for growth overall. And just to illustrate that, I'll show you lots of really working through the mics here. To illustrate that, I'll show you one final set of data. So on other analyses we've done, we've linked the universe of patent records in the US to the tax data so we can measure who goes on to become an inventor in America. What we're plotting here is your chance of becoming an inventor versus your parents' income. And what you can see is that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times more likely to become an inventor than if you're born to lower income parents. When we dig deeper, turns out that it's all the factors I've been talking about that drive this exposure, who you're connected to, the environment you're growing up in. That's really driving this sharp gradient. That's true not just in the context of patenting and science, it's also true in the context of founding businesses. So if you look at who goes on to become a successful entrepreneur in America, and again, in a paper we'll be releasing next year, it's even more extreme in that context. Look at sort of the job creators in America. They tend to come from a very selected subset of families. And so why do I emphasize this? What this shows is that if we could expand opportunities, it's not just about giving those kids better chances of rising up. If we had more inventors, more entrepreneurs, all of the rest of us would benefit too from better technologies, from new discoveries, from better jobs that would increase economic growth in the Houston area overall. And so I think that perspective is also very important to keep in mind, and it's important to keep in mind for businesses. That's the business case for being interested in investing in all this. I'll end by noting that that issue is not a minor one. We estimate that there's an enormous number of what we call lost Einsteins. We would have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do if kids from lower income families, underrepresented minority backgrounds, and women were to invent at the same rate as high income white men. And so in that sense, I think there's tremendous potential here to have an impact. And so the last thing I want to say, I've shown you a bunch of different data, a bunch of different possibilities for policy interventions that I think could make a difference, that the data show can make a difference. Often people ask me, in the current environment, lots of different challenges, divisions in society, this research is interesting and it's great, but are we actually seeing examples of people implementing this? Can we actually do this on the ground? So I just want to leave you with a couple of examples in other cities where our team has been engaged. In Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the lowest upward mobility cities in the US, where over the past decade, our team has spent quite a bit of time motivated by that data. A number of partners have come together, from businesses to local stakeholders, the mayor, lots of different investments that I think have made a measurable impact in Charlotte. Turns out in the most recent data our team released, Charlotte has one of the cities with the biggest increases in upward mobility. Now we're doing a lot of work in Philadelphia, where there's also similar momentum to make change. And so I very much hope similar change and further progress will be possible here in Houston. Thanks so much.
Well, Raj, thank you. That was really fantastic. A lot of information that you shared with us. And I just want to share on behalf of this room, Houstonians are extremely proud of Houston. We're a phenomenal community of people that care deeply about every single person in our community. And that's why we invited you to come and share some of this information, not because we find it interesting, but because we want to put it to use. We want to do something about it. And one thing I just want to start off with is just to highlight that in Houston, we have a huge booming economy. We're very proud of that. But we're very concerned about the fact that not everyone is benefiting from that economy. Many of us have seen the recent data on the really high poverty rates that we have in Houston. And so we really want to do something about this. So I want to just congratulate you for the work that you've done. And as a fellow researcher, I just want to underscore that there were a few sentences there that took Raj just a few seconds to say. But I know that those sentences took years to produce. Seriously, right? Right? I'm not exaggerating at all. And I hope some of you caught some of those sentences And I want to appreciate your work, and I just want that, yeah. Okay, so I want to start off by asking you just a couple of questions about this work that you shared. And of course, I want to start by jumping into social capital, because I'm a sociologist. And sociologists think social capital is extremely important. And so I was delighted to see an economist agree. Yes, but one of the things that you mentioned in terms of increasing and improving social capital was, one of the potential mechanisms is to reduce segregation, right? If we can get more opportunities for people to interact together, and especially across income categories, that has a lot of potential, and I couldn't agree with you more. But there's a but. We know through research, and a lot of it is sociological research actually, that we have a lot of segregation, especially among families with children. I don't know if you all knew that, but families with children are among the most segregated in the nation. And of course, that's where all the potential lies. So I wonder if you have anything to say about what we might be able to do to overcome that particular barrier, right? It's families with children that are the most segregated, and that's where the most potential lies. What actions can we take there?
So thanks, Ruth. So hopefully the mic is working. It is not working.
Turn it on, turn it on.
All right, is it working now?
Yeah.
All right. So it's a great question. It gets to, I think, a core issue. Let me answer it in two parts. So first, how can we increase integration? I showed you some data on how integration matters. That was from a paper we published in the journal Nature a few years ago. We had a second paper in Nature that gets to your question, Ruth, of what drives levels of segregation versus integration. And I find it useful to conceptualize it as follows. So there are two things that matter for whether you interact with someone else. The first is exposure. So are kids living in the same neighborhoods, going to the same schools as kids from different backgrounds? Obviously, you can't be friends with, you can't connect with people you never meet. So if we have a society where all the high-income kids go to one school district and all the other low-income kids go to a different one, you're going to have a lot of disconnection by class. But there's a second mechanism that turns out to be equally important, which is that even among kids going to the same school, we find in the Facebook data that there's a lot of segregation by class, even if you're in the same rooms, in the same buildings. And you all may have experienced that just intuitively. If you look at, in large urban school districts in particular, you might have a school that appears integrated on the surface, but when you kind of dig deeper and look at where kids are sitting at the lunch table in the cafeteria or what their friend groups look like, there's a lot of separation by class lines, by racial lines, and so forth. And so what we find in the data is what really matters, the reason I'm emphasizing this, is ultimately that cross-class connection, not just being in the same building as somebody from a different background, but actually interacting with them. Now, it turns out that both things are equally important in explaining the social disconnection in America, the lack of exposure, the fact that we tend to live in different neighborhoods, work in different places, go to different colleges, and so on, based on our class. That's half of it. But even if we were to perfectly integrate every college, every school, and so on, we would still have half of the social disconnection by class left. And that shows you that the second notion, what we term friending bias, is also extremely important, understanding why people are not interacting, even if we do somehow manage to get them in the same areas. And there, I find it instructive to note that the types of friendships that people form vary greatly depending upon where they meet people. So we find in the same Facebook analysis, we can look at where friendships are being formed. The same person tends to form many more cross-class friendships in their religious group or in recreational activities relative to the number of cross-class friendships they form in their school or at their employer. And so my intuition from that is that if there's certain settings where you feel like you have something in common with someone, a shared faith, a shared sports team, something like that, that brings people together. And I think one important thing that we can do, even stopping short of figuring out how we integrate our neighborhoods, is take the existing integration we have and make better use of it, thinking about programming that actually gets kids from different backgrounds to find that common ground, to connect and so forth. So that's one, I think, important element. Let me now directly answer your second question. You need that exposure. You need the integration to begin with. What kinds of strategies can be helpful there? I gave you one example with the moving to opportunity housing voucher approach, which was kind of a decentralized integration. We generally find that that kind of approach, kind of a market-based integration, you give people the resources and support needed to move to higher opportunity areas. That works. In contrast, building hard units, as I'm sure you're all aware, kind of NIMBYism, try to put up a big building that's classified as affordable housing in a higher income area, much more resistance to that.
Right.
And so I think that kind of decentralized integration approach can be part of our toolkit. Now, one thing people often ask me is, you've emphasized the benefits for low-income kids of living in more integrated areas. What about potential costs to the higher income kids? Do they lose if you're living in a more mixed income area? Because that could then be a source of NIMBYism and opposition. And it turns out you can look at that in the data as well. You can ask in more mixed income communities, do we see worse outcomes for kids growing up in high income families? And it turns out, interestingly, maybe there's a modest negative effect, but there's nowhere near the same impact as the benefits of integration for low income kids. It's kind of an asymmetric thing. And so I would stress, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not like some kids get ahead and then the other kids have to do worse. You can actually expand the size of the pie here. And so I would argue, coming to your question, Ruth, trying to get that message out there that you don't have to be afraid of this. It's not like we're fighting over some fixed pie. I think that is extremely important for people to understand.
I agree. That's a huge part of the messaging, because a lot of people are afraid. I think that's why families with children are the most segregated, because they're afraid, they want to protect their children. And it turns out that this is actually more beneficial than there is at any cost. And I also want to highlight one thing that you mentioned in the first part of your answer about there are layers. It's like peeling the layers of an onion, right? There's desegregation and then integration, right? Just taking it to the next level, which is really what is ultimately needed. And I love that you pointed out some of the mechanisms by which we can have that level of integration. When you mentioned community activities and sports or faith-based organizations and so forth. And I saw Steve Ives' face light up. Steve Ives is the CEO of the YMCA of Greater Houston, and I know that they are working hard on thinking about how can they play a role in bringing people together from across different classes, different races, ethnicities, et cetera. And I think what you're saying is basically saying, Steve, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
That's how I interpret that.
And if I can just give you another example, Ruth, that comes to mind that's in that vein, city of Atlanta, incredibly segregated city, one of the lowest mobility cities we see in our data. I like an example they have there which illustrates how we can do this. So some of you may know the MARTA train line that runs through Atlanta. It runs through some of the highest income neighborhoods and lowest income neighborhoods. So under the MARTA line, they've developed a new thing where they have soccer fields, and they've created a soccer league with kids from these different neighborhoods who take the MARTA to play soccer with each other. That's the idea. And that creates integration between kids who otherwise never would have come into contact with each other. So we don't know yet, is that going to have a big impact, et cetera? But it's the kind of thinking, that I think can make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. This is very exciting. So another question that I have for you has to do with these two approaches, or there are multiple approaches, but the two that I want to emphasize are, one is that we can help people move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, and the other is that we can invest in existing neighborhoods and try to make them higher opportunity neighborhoods. And of course, I don't think I understood you to say both approaches. Let's take on both approaches. I don't think it's one or the other. However, I would love to hear a little bit more from you about the pros and cons of each approach, and in particular because I assume that one approach actually has an effect on the other approach, and can you say a little bit more about that, especially if we take on both simultaneously and how they affect one another?
Yeah, so let me underscore that I absolutely do not think of these as like you have to choose between this or that. We should be doing both. The way to think about the moving to opportunity approach, often a different way to phrase your question, I think, Ruth, is that going to have a negative, like destabilizing effect that we're helping a bunch of families move out in the neighborhoods they leave behind? Could there be adverse consequences from that? I think the right way to think about the moving to opportunity approach is not that, but rather to recognize most low-income families in America end up moving a lot anyway. this is a population that has very high rates of housing turnover because of evictions or a job loss or other challenges that come up. And so do you take the Seattle example I gave you? All of those families, or more than 90% of them, were going to move neighborhoods anyway. Even in the control group, everybody practically moved to a different neighborhood. So the issue is not so much that we are taking families that were happily living in a given neighborhood and kind of plucking them and moving them somewhere else. It's that they were going to move. And I think of it as kind of redirecting the flows that were going to occur anyway. And can we support those families in making the choices that we all would want to make for our own kids? We're moving anyway. We want to get information. There are lots of resources at the higher end of the housing market, people who want to help you find housing for a fee in different neighborhoods. And essentially, we're trying to support that process at the lower end for lower income folks as well. And so in that sense, I actually don't think there's a destabilization cost. Now, that being said, clearly you can't just say, now we've helped a bunch of families move. We don't need to worry about the neighborhoods that they were living in previously. We need to do something to support those neighborhoods as well. That's why, I think the Hope 6 kind of intervention is promising. That particular intervention also, to be clear, had significant costs. Many people got displaced at the time. Some of you might know it was a very controversial program that people thought, why are we literally displacing huge numbers of people? And so thinking about, are there ways to achieve the gains that I showed you for the children without being tremendously disruptive, I think is another very important area to think about in that second bucket.
But that's challenging. That's very challenging.
That is challenging, but that's where I think also understanding the mechanisms that matter here, from improvements in schools to connections to surrounding areas. Can we get at that more precisely without literally demolishing the public housing and rebuilding? Can we have more efficient ways to get there? It would be helpful to think about.
And that's where it's also helpful to understand the return on that investment, which you're showing it can be huge.
Very large.
Yeah. Another question that I have has to do with immigrants. Houston is an immigrant receiving community. 1 in 4 residents is foreign born. So we have a lot of immigrants, and immigrants contribute a lot to our community. But one of the things that I noted from some of the data that you shared was, because it's based on IRS data, you need to have, tax records for the child and the parent in order to understand how much has improved or not across generations. That there are some data limitations, right? Especially, I would assume that you probably have less data available for immigrants, and I wonder if you could speculate for us if you were able to, have the ideal. I know there's no such thing as a perfect data set, but if you were to have a perfect data set and had no missing data, especially for immigrants, how do you think that might alter your findings?
Question. Yeah, great question. So let me first say a little bit more about the data we were actually looking at today, and then tell you how we can bring immigrants into the picture. So what was the sample when I said 20 million kids in the first map? Who was that actually about? That's about all kids in those birth cohorts in the early 1980s whom we can link to parents using tax records. So to be able to say you grew up in a family that was at the 25th percentile, I need to be able to see your parents' income, right? And if your parents are not in the United States, obviously we don't see your parents' income in US tax data. And so we do actually end up including a number of immigrants. So I came to this country when I was 9 years old. My parents moved from India to the US. I'm in that first map because my parents are in the US and we're able to measure their incomes. And so in that sense, immigrants are included. The people who are not included are people who came, let's say you came here when you were 25, your parents were never here in the US. Number of folks immigrate to Houston in that way, they would not be included in this particular analysis. But we see their data along with everybody else's in terms of their own incomes, right?
Right.
And so in other analysis we've done, we have put out statistics on people's own incomes and then their children's incomes depending on their country of origin, and compared that to rates of upward mobility for US natives. And the basic takeaways, so we've put out this data publicly, and then it's been subsequently further analyzed by some scholars named Ron Abramitsky at Stanford and Leah Bustan at Princeton. And basically what you see both in the present day and in historical analysis they've done is that immigrants almost uniformly have much higher rates of upward mobility than US natives. Why is that? Part of it is that it's kind of a selection effect. So you hear the anecdote of you've got somebody who's highly trained, may have been an engineer or a doctor or something, couldn't get that license in the US, ends up working in a lower paid occupation. Their kids still have that human capital from the parents and end up doing quite well relative to their parents' income. So it looks like they have a very high rate of upward mobility. That's part of it. But another important piece of it, and this is something Ron and Leah show with using our data, is that immigrants, if you look at where they end up choosing to live, they tend to choose to live in the highest opportunity areas, in the highest upward mobility places. And so the simple way I think about it is often immigrant families will end up trying to buy the smallest house in the best school district. The priority is why did you come to this country to begin with? Is to try to get better opportunities often for your children. You're going to do everything you can to try to make that happen. And that piece of it turns out to explain a lot of why you see high rates of upward mobility for immigrants. Now, that is not universal by any means, but those are the broad patterns you see in the data.
So then in conclusion, you would say if you were able to have, magically have data on all immigrants, your findings might actually be
further
an
reinforced.
Underestimate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, really exciting stuff. Before I turn to the audience Q&A, so I hope you all are formulating your questions already. And in a moment, we'll have someone with a microphone walk around. So if you have a question, make sure you raise your hand up high so that the mic can reach you. But before we do that, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, let me, say one last thing, Ruth, which is a little bit of a preview of where we're headed on our team and maybe useful to a number of people here. So we're talking about, and we're interested in developing lots of new interventions. I've had interesting conversations with a number of you already about new programs you're starting, other things you think are promising that you've seen in recent years. And in my view, one of the big challenges in public policy and the social sciences has been figuring out which things actually work and which things don't. I gave you some examples of that, like the Year Up job training program, Hope 6, the voucher programs, and we were able to painstakingly evaluate sometimes with randomized trials which things worked and which things didn't. Recently, something that we've been developing in our group, which I think could be quite useful in this context, is a way to, in a very low-cost manner, evaluate which programs are working and which programs are not, without ever having to run a randomized trial, which, as you all know, is the gold standard form of evaluation, but is incredibly expensive to implement, hard to enroll people in, and so on. And in a nutshell, our approach, you can think of it as essentially finding digital twins for each person participating in a given program. It's what we call in economics a matching approach, where what we do is, let's say you've got a set of people participating in a program you're interested in. If we get that information simply on who is participating in your program, we can link that to the tax and census data covering the full US population that our team is working with, and in a privacy protected way, find a set of other people, I'm calling digital twins, who look identical to the people who participated in your program in terms of their age, their prior earnings history, where they're living, and so on. They look incredibly similar. And what we find is if we compare the earnings trajectories of the people who participated in a given program with those matched digital twins to form a comparison group, you can get an estimate of the treatment effect of the program that turns out to very closely replicate what we get from randomized trials. We've done a number of validation studies where we say, here is the gold standard estimate from an RCT, here's an estimate from our matching approach. Turns out the two line up together very closely. It's basically a function of having enormous amounts of data. In the age of data, we're able to make this matching digital twin approach work. And the reason that could be so useful is because now it makes it essentially costless. It's like algorithmic. If you've got essentially a list of names of people who participate in your program, we can do this analysis and tell you here were the impacts on their future earnings, on the jobs they had, on their career trajectory, on where they're living. And my view is that kind of input is really what's necessary to facilitate innovation in the nonprofit space, in the public policy space, so we can really devote our resources to the most effective programs. So if that's of interest to people here, we're certainly happy to have conversations about that. Please feel free to reach out to me, or David Forte, my colleague from our team, is here as well. I think there's a lot of possibility with this kind of approach.
It's like an alternate universe.
That's exactly
I
it.
like it. Lots of potential. All right, audience questions. We'd love to entertain a few questions. I saw a hand. We'll start back in that corner, and then we'll come to you, Bob.
Sure. You're supposed to hold it. Okay. Hi, this is Michelle from Capital Idea Houston. You mentioned Project Quest, which is our sister organization in San Antonio, right? And so some of the challenges that we face sometimes with funders is that the price that, the cost to train our participants is really high. Yeah. Versus, the quantity that they would like us to train. Could you just share a little bit about the impact with Year Up, Project Quest, and that greater investment and outcome versus the quantity that sometimes our funders want?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, those kinds of programs give you rough ballpark figures. Obviously, it varies by program, but costs something like $10,000 per person, sometimes a little bit more than that up front. And then you could see in the graph that I showed you, generates a $9,000 per year earnings gain, persists over 10, 20 years, then longer into the future as far as we can tell. So from a social point of view, that is an incredible rate of return, right? If you invest in something that you put up 10,000 once and it pays you 9,000 every year for 20 years, like you would want to buy that stock if you could. Now the problem obviously is it's a social return. Somebody's got to put that money up front. And so in econ terms, you would say there's an externality problem. You're not able to capture those social returns, a piece of them for yourself. And I think that's limited the ability to scale programs like the one that you're describing. And one of the things we're working on, which actually builds on this measurement method that I just described to you a second ago, once we can quantify in hard terms what the impacts are of these programs, it potentially creates a vehicle to build new financial models to support these programs. Let me give you one example that we're actually, just yesterday I was in Austin talking with folks about trying to pilot this here in Texas, and we're working with the federal government as well. Suppose we can not only measure the incremental earnings, but we can also, using the same method, measure the incremental savings to taxpayers as a result of people making $9,000 more every year. Average tax rates in this income range are something like 15%, so it's going to generate about $1,500 of extra tax revenue for the government every year. Trying to develop a system where we basically take that incremental tax revenue and pay it back to private investors so that now you can create an asset that's basically a private capital market for investing in successful programs. I think innovative models like that could help, with this new measurement, help scale these sorts of programs. That's, I think, exactly the kinds of problems we should be thinking about.
Bob.
Thank you very much. Bob Sanborn with Children at Risk. Raj, your stuff is fantastic, so thank you very much for being down here with us. One of the things that we work on in Children at Risk is early education. And I want to get your ideas around the impact of early education, childcare, and its impact on sort of ending poverty or ending that cycle of poverty. And to give you just a little bit of context, we're in the middle of the very beginnings of forming a larger collaborative in Houston to focus on this. And for 10 years, we've been at the state level with support of the Kellogg Foundation, really getting both political sides to say, yes, this is an important thing. And we focused on workforce development as a way to really get Republicans and Democrats alike to say this is important. And so we're about to launch a larger initiative in Houston. Maybe is some of the stuff that comes from Heckman or any other stuff that you think in terms of the importance of early education?
Yeah, absolutely. And your colleague here, Flavio Cunha, who will speak later, has also done a lot of terrific work in this space with Jim Heckman and others. Early education, no doubt, is incredibly important. You're alluding to work that Jim Heckman has done on things like the Perry preschool program and Abecedarian. There are other efforts from a long time ago that show a lot of promise. Other things that have been done on larger scales as well. I'll give you an example from some of our own research that is a little bit later in the life cycle than the preschool years. So take kindergarten teachers. So there was a famous experiment called the Tennessee Star experiment that randomly assigned kids to different classrooms in Tennessee back in the late 1980s. We were able to link that data to the tax record data, follow the kids over time, and actually one of the first papers we wrote in the space was called, "How Does Your Kindergarten Teacher Affect Your Earnings When You're 30 Years Old?" And it turns out your kindergarten teacher has a big effect on your earnings when you're 30 years old. And you can measure that directly. If you happen to get lucky and have a better teacher, it really has a measurable impact. Why do you see that measurable impact? This again relates to research that Jim and Flavio and others have done. It's not so much the mechanics of learning, math better or reading and so on. We actually find that those effects, if you look at kids' test scores over time from having a better teacher going to a better preschool, they often fade out very rapidly. And by the time you're looking at middle schoolers, you don't see big differences. A lot of people in the education literature thought, oh, this looks really disappointing, like maybe these interventions don't have lasting effects. But what's really surprising is that you see that fade out pattern, but then it reemerges in adulthood, where when you look at earnings, when you look at college attendance, when you look at teenage birth rates, you start to see the impacts reappear. So why is that happening? It looks like one of the key channels is what people sometimes call non-cognitive skills or social psychological skills. These are things like how well do you get along with others? How disciplined are you? When you have that better teacher earlier on, or you go to a better preschool program, we see really lasting effects that don't fade out on these non-cognitive margins. And those measures are actually even more predictive of success later on in life than things like your math and English test scores. And so all of that's to say, I think early education can be incredibly important. It's maybe through mechanisms that might be different than what you'd initially think. But I think it's very important to see this as a pipeline, as I was emphasizing with that graph where you saw the downward slope moving from one neighbor to another. I don't think we can have the view that it's just about early education and then we're done. I'm glad to hear you emphasizing workforce development kind of on the other end of the pipeline. I think we need to build a pipeline all the way from birth to adulthood that's strong to truly have success.
Yet another reason why we need to pay our early childhood education folks a lot more. You can use that as a messaging, right?
Yeah.
This affects your future salary.
Yeah, actually, the title of the New York Times article about that paper was "The Case for the $320,000 Kindergarten Teacher."
You all laugh, but there was a case there. Also, fun fact, Flavio's doctoral advisor was Heckman. So, yes, that's right. All right, any other questions? Yes. Hang on, wait for the mic. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This has really been enlightening. My question would be, what is sort of the perfect ratio of low income to high income in a particular environment? Because as we start to see in some of the data that you're showing, when you start getting into a high opportunity area, getting concentrated poverty, does it turn into a low opportunity area? I mean, not at the margins maybe so much, but where is that just really healthy balance of high and middle income and low income?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In the social science literature, it goes to sociology as well. People call this the notion of tipping points. Like if you go too far, then a neighborhood can unravel the other way in the integration you've tried to achieve.
Flight.
You have flight essentially by race or by income, et cetera. And so I don't know if we have a precise number, like it's X percent. My guess is it depends upon context and so on. Your intuition is right that too much integration may not be sustainable, basically. But I also think this comes back to one of the questions you asked, Ruth, that it's important to educate higher income people and to recognize that that is not necessarily coming at the cost of high income families. Particularly, I think if you can assure basics like safety and if you don't have issues of crime and so on, then I think everyone can really come out ahead here. And I think if you're also supporting lower income families in other ways, through things like workforce development and so on, that can give them pathways to thrive at the same time, that gives them a way to stay in the neighborhood and also creates less disparities between people living in a given community, you'd have less of the flight. But absolutely, I think this is something to consider. I'm actually reminded of a story that Jeff Canada, who started the Harlem Children's Zone, as you'll know, very successful in New York and revitalizing Harlem, told me, he said, in a way he feels like he's the victim of his own success in Harlem, where he says, they were so successful that now Harlem has become unaffordable to the families he wanted to help to begin with. And so I think being cognizant of that is extremely important from the get-go.
Yes, back here. Hang on, wait for the mic. Just so we can all hear your great question. It's coming. It's coming. There you go.
Just a question. So the Urban Institute has out an upward mobility framework.
Yeah.
Communities are starting to work on this. There's 24 metrics, et cetera.
Yes.
All very interesting, similar to some of the information that you've presented. I just wondered, are you all connected at all? And
Yes.
how does that work?
Hang on. Before you answer that, we're actually going to hear from Sarah Wartell tomorrow. So y'all are going to hear a lot more about that very soon, but go ahead.
No, I was just going to say tomorrow morning,
Okay,
Sarah can
same
answer
thing.
that question in much greater detail than I can. And I think there's a lot of alignment in the way that we're thinking about things, and their efforts to really try to translate some of the broader research findings to implementation on the ground, I think are going to be very helpful for you all as well. So I will let Sarah speak to that.
Great question. Stay tuned. I guess we'll come to you in the front. Oh, never mind, because the mic is already in the back. Sorry.
Hi, Melanie Johnson. You know, your work, Raj, certainly affirms what I have believed for some time now historically, that integration truly helps children from low-income communities to aspire and to become. But and we've always thought this, I mean, of course, Horace Mann, when he originated our public education system, said, you know, I want no private schools. I want children to integrate with each other so that powerful voices can speak for voices that have less opportunity to be heard. And then, of course, Finland certainly affirms that by always ranking in the highest, you know, among nations. And so you mentioned that we didn't have to do a significant investment of $17 billion for upward mobility for housing, that we could do things as simple as you know, integrating transit. So I'm really curious about states like New York, where everyone's in the subway from high income, low income. Is that do they have better outcomes due to the fact that they are integrated through transit?
Yeah, no, it's a nice question. I mean, there are some studies I've seen recently that actually take the social network data, the Facebook data, and show that when there's a new train line built in New York City, actually, it turns out, you see significant changes in who people are interacting with. Now, does that ultimately translate to changes in their outcomes? You know, we don't quite have the data yet to necessarily figure that out, but walking through the chain of logic that I described here, I would imagine absolutely that could be a pathway that ultimately, you know, that interaction based on everything I showed you translates into better outcomes as well. Now, is transit, you know, how much does it move the needle? Is it enough? I suspect, you know, it can be part of the puzzle, but additional programs, you know, my intuition is that you need to do more to really create those deliberate spaces where it's not just, you know, I ride the subway by where you live, but I have a reason to actually interact with you in a certain space. I think that's extremely important.
Whoever you can get to the fastest. Oh, I guess that's...
Hi, Carolyn Watson, head of the Farish Fund. I was really excited to hear that you're partnering with government, and maybe we can have a special session on how to do that later. Because right now, the government is not showing up as a partner, and the interventions you described, Hope 6, housing vouchers, we just can't count on those anymore. So how do we think about these interventions absent government as a partner?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is why I also think at some point, even if government was a partner, we need to think about other financial models. The first answer I gave to one of the questions from the audience, I'm trying to use private capital and find ways to reward private capital for investing in these kinds of successful programs, I think is one vehicle. I think philanthropy has a role to play. I think philanthropic investment itself can potentially be made more impactful through the kind of measurement tools that I've been describing, where you can actually see year after year with your portfolio of investments, what was the concrete impact in terms of changes in earnings for the people you were trying to support using the digital twinning kind of methodology that I was describing. So I would argue, of course, it would be beneficial if government were investing in these programs where we see very high rates of return. I hope at some point with this kind of evidence, we can get there. And I do see promising signs from conversations I've been having at the local level, at the state level, at various different levels where I think we can make progress. But I think in parallel, we should be thinking about how we can deploy other forms of capital as well and not rely solely on the government to move these things forward. And my view is that with modern data and measurement, that actually may end up being feasible and is concretely something we are actively piloting at the moment, possibly here in Texas and other places as well.
Right. Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So who thinks they...
Waiting in the
Who
front here.
who has a good question to end with? Okay, well,
We're happy to just take a couple and then I can answer.
we
them.
can have let's have two then.
And
You
I'll wait to
go ahead. You and then you in the front because you've had your hand up for a while. I
Thanks.
remembered.
My table voted for me, if that counts.
Yes.
I'm Amanda Tim. I'm with the Houston Economic Growth Collaborative, a new place-based initiative focusing on 4 neighborhoods in Northeast Houston, focusing on this and trying to make progress on economic mobility. The question I have is, what does the data tell you about the impact on the larger metro economy when that range is narrower or skewing towards upward mobility? Do you have any data on that? Thanks.
Yeah. Great question. That's a little bit along the lines of what I was trying to get to at the end with those specific examples of patenting and entrepreneurship. And you could see how there are these broader benefits for the economy when you have higher rates of upward mobility. I don't think we or anybody else has a statistic that quantifies, if you have this level of improvement in upward mobility, this is going to be the aggregate impact in the city, basically because it's hard to measure that cause and effect very clearly. You've got to have the right comparison groups and so on. So I could see how you could add up from some of the benefits I've been describing, where you have increased productivity for individual workers, you have more entrepreneurship, you have more innovation. We have estimates from other work on how beneficial all these things are. My qualitative sense is you are going to get quite big numbers in terms of the benefits of trying to increase upward mobility. Think of it as, go back to that first map I showed of Houston. There is, in a nutshell, a huge amount of talent that's not being harnessed in some of these places that could be brought in to increase the productivity of the Houston region. And if you just add up the number of people there, the lost Einsteins as I was describing it, there's an enormous potential impact on local growth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question. I didn't forget.
The winner is me. No, I'm just kidding. Hello, everyone. My name is Sierra Joseph. I am a passionate educator, 8th graders. And so I was invited.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I wanted to give an affirmation first to Mr. Steve because I was not invited. Someone brought me with her. And he said, hey, come with me. I'll make sure you get in. I did not have...
Wow,
I did not
Steve.
have... Oh, did the mic go out? It's okay. I did not have a seat at the table, but he pulled me up one, literally. And so when you're talking about exposure, as a passionate educator, my heart is just like moving, all sitting in this spot. But what would you suggest my next step could be with this? I have students from all different backgrounds. So what would you suggest with your research? What can my next step be tomorrow when I walk into my classroom? Because my kids do miss me since I'm here.
Well, I'm so glad you can be here and be part of this. And I would say, just in very simple words, maybe to wrap up here, connecting people to opportunity is the way I would think about it. And how you might do that in your own work is take those kids from the many different backgrounds you described and think about how do you get them to interact with each other? How do you get them to be exposed to some of the things we've been talking about, career paths they may not have been thinking about what their goals and aspirations are, and helping them shape those aspirations, maybe think about things they otherwise would not have thought of in their own communities. And I hope that will be transformational for them, as we see it has been for many others.
All right, thanks. Thank you. I hope that one of the things that comes, one of the takeaways from Raj's comments today is that this is not charity. This is not just like us helping those people that are in need of our assistance. That's not it. This is us helping ourselves, quite frankly. We as a society need to make sure that we are providing all the opportunities possible for everyone. And who stands to benefit? We all do. We all do. So with that, thank you so much, Raj. We appreciate you. Oh, there you are. I was going to invite you up.